It is with tremendous gratitude and complete humility that I introduce Dr. Elizabeth McIngvale.
Thank y'all so much. I was wondering what my walkout song would be, so I appreciate that one. And yes, in case you're wondering, I am pregnant, so we'll just get that out there. And Dr. Samuel is more than qualified to deliver a baby anywhere, so I am in good hands tonight. But in all seriousness, thank you. I'm really honored to be here. I'm honored to be a voice for mental health. And I think so many times when we see individuals from the outside that appear to be doing well, that appear to be functioning, we make the assumption that they're not struggling. And what we know and what Mosaics and so many others teach us is that that is so far from the truth. I'm so grateful for Paul Raj introducing me to this organization last year where I got to learn about the life-saving work that you do. And I do believe you are probably one of the only in the nation that does this. I know, and so many people in this room know what it's like to spend years going to clinicians who don't know how to help you, who are not qualified, who are not doing evidence-based care, and you just get worse. And unfortunately, what we know is that untreated mental health doesn't just get worse, it often leads to high mortality. And we have an opportunity to change that. I also want to say with a little bit of hope and grace that I do feel like we're at a place in society where we're starting to change that. People are talking about mental health more than they ever did, and we are receptive and understanding that it is a need that we can no longer ignore. I grew up in this area of town, went to John Cooper School, which I know there's a lot of Cooper people here. So I think that, a lot of people will ask me, when did you first notice OCD, notice anxiety? And the reality is that we actually had no idea that there was anything going on. I had a pretty normal life. I was a competitive gymnast. I did well in school, did well, had good friendships and all of the above. And I tell people that our family story was that everything was fine. It was normal until it wasn't. And unfortunately, that shift when it's impacted by mental health tends to happen quite rapidly. I always did little things. I would track the weather and I would tell my parents, oh, there's a tornado in Topeka. You guys can't leave the house. And my parents would be like, well, good thing we live in Houston. We have to go to work today. Or I would start books at page 1. I remember reading the book Matilda and sitting in the car with my mom one day and her saying, Liz, that's what bookmarks are for. You don't have to start at page 1, but I couldn't shake the feeling. And I had these little things, but really they were quirks. They were not impacting my life or my functioning. And so we didn't think much of it. But slowly and surely, I started to have these dark, unwanted, terrible, intrusive thoughts. Thoughts that were attached to things that meant so much to me. So things like, if you don't do this, something bad will happen to someone you love. Your family member won't go to heaven. There will be this terrible outcome and it'll be your fault. And unfortunately, these were attached with extreme anxiety and distress. And so I started doing these weird behaviors, whether it was a hand wash or reassurance seeking or going in and out of a doorway to try to feel better. And before you knew it, my life was filled with obsessive compulsive behaviors. When it really took a turn for me, we were actually going on a field trip at school to Mo Ranch. I don't know how many of y'all know of Mo Ranch or your kids go there or whatever. And that night, I was actually supposed to go stay at a friend's house who's here tonight, and I started asking my mom all these bizarre questions. I started saying things like, well, Mom, what if something happens when I'm gone? Or what if some of the clothes I packed, some of my friends have the same clothes and they're upset with me, and if they're upset with me, do you think they'll hurt themselves? And if they do, would it be my fault? And started displaying all this anxiety. And my mom's answer was, Liz, you don't have to go stay the night. Don't worry, you can just stay home tonight. Your brother will take you to school in the morning. So I said, okay. My mom had to take my sister to the airport to go to DC the next morning, and my brother James drove me to the airport. And when James drove me to the airport, I am a little bit older than the current generation, he asked me to put a CD in the CD-ROM. And so I took the CD and I started putting it in and out, and I was counting and doing all these behaviors. And he thought it was kind of strange, and I started asking him all these questions of, do you think Laura's going to be safe on her trip? Do you think something will happen to her? What do you think? And he drops me off, and this was an important part of the story because my mom talks about how my brother came home that night, and he said, Mom, I don't know what's going on with Liz, but she was doing some really weird things. And he starts describing it to her. And my mom talks about how that was the first time anybody else recognized what she had been seeing. She had been talking to my dad about it on occasion, and my dad actually at one point said, Linda, I think maybe you should see a therapist because Liz is fine. And she was like, okay, Mac, don't think so. But, you oftentimes, when you're dealing with mental health, there's so much stigma, so much shame that we're hiding it from everybody we know. And oftentimes there's one safe person, for me it was my mom, who sees these symptoms and behaviors. Unfortunately, Mo Ranch for a kid with undiagnosed OCD was recipe for disaster. So communal showers, cafeteria food. I didn't eat, didn't shower that week. And my mom talks about how when I got off that bus that day, when they came to pick us up on Friday, she had a pit in her stomach and she knew something was really wrong. And at this point, it was clear that it wasn't quirks, that there was something else happening. I'd lost a lot of weight. I was really gaunt and was struggling. And I remember going home that night and I said to my mom, Mom, I don't know what's going on, but please don't make me go back to school. And her answer was, well, Liz, okay, I won't make you go back to school if you tell me what's going on. But if you don't tell me what's going on, I can't help you. And I remember, I didn't know what the word ritual even meant. I remember that vividly, but I remember sitting on the floor crying with my mom and saying, Mom, I'm having all these thoughts and all these fears. And if I don't do these rituals, which I don't know what that word means, but it seems to make sense. I said, if I don't do these, I feel like something terrible is going to happen. And my mom, being a mom, tried to use logic, right? She said, well, Liz, that's not true. that that's not how that works. You don't have the power, that if you have thoughts, they don't mean anything. However, she also at the time knew she needed to start looking for help. We grew up here in Houston, Texas, world's largest medical center, and in a family who frankly is well-connected, had resources and opportunities to get in touch with the right people to get me to the right help. But it didn't exist. We spent the next 5 years searching for effective treatment. I would go to clinicians who would play Candyland with me and ask me what it felt like when I crossed the bridge, and nobody who understood how to appropriately assess, diagnose, or treat the illness that I was dealing with. Unfortunately, during this time, my OCD got a lot worse. I was taking 6 to 8 hour showers. I was doing everything in these repetitive numbers, and every day I would ask a family member to kill me. Because there was no way I could imagine living the way I was living. For individuals who've lived with mental health disorders or any mental illness, the pain is unbearable. And when it doesn't feel like there's a way out and the people who are supposed to be able to help you can't imagine moving on. I always talk about the fact that I'm grateful that my parents will tell you that they were, they're in the furniture industry, in case you didn't know that, and here in Houston. And so they always talk about they're so grateful that they are sellers, not buyers, and they weren't buying the stories of so many clinicians. Clinicians who would sit across from my parents and me when I was a young teenager and tell me that they had never seen a case this severe. My parents should assume I would live in a mental health hospital the rest of my life and that treatment would not be able to help me. That is the message that most of us hear. And for all intents and purposes, it's the message most of us would believe. I always tell people my parents are high school graduates. They don't have college degrees. They're just hardworking individuals who really, they should have believed the medical professionals telling them this. But they were also my parents. They were and are the two people who became my champion, who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. And so my parents set up this 24-hour kind of watch crew where literally my sister, my brother, his wife, not at the time, it was his girlfriend, and my parents would watch me and be with me 24/7 because I was not safe to be home alone. And some friends would interchange that spot while they just continued to search for help. And I continued to get worse. At the time, I had all these fears around religion, and there's this type of OCD called scrupulosity, and I was really triggered about if I did something wrong, someone wouldn't go to heaven, and that would be my fault. And so I would do everything in multiples of numbers, everything I did in a day. And for whatever reason, I had all these fears around the number 6. But I also, my mom's age at the time, not to age her, she's not here, so it's fine, was 42. And so I, for whatever reason, started doing things in multiples of 42. I know it makes no sense. 4 plus 2 is 6. OCD doesn't make sense. It's not logical. But I felt like, okay, since her birth, like right now her age is a bad number, I need to do everything in this number. And so I did everything in my day 42 times. I would wake up in the morning, I would sit up and down 42 times. I would move my body 42 times. I would take my first step 42 times. By the time I got to the bathroom, I was sweating and exhausted, and I would turn the sink faucet on 42 times, rinse my hands 42 times, get 42 pumps of soap, wash my hands 42 times, turn the faucet off 42 times. And my OCD would say, that's one set, you should do 42 sets of 42. And so as you can imagine, everyday tasks became impossible. I went from a kid who was totally functioning to a kid that if you came by our house or saw me in public, you knew I was sick at this point. I looked sick. I looked disheveled in many different ways, and I started to do things like avoiding showering and avoiding functioning, avoiding going places because of how hard it was. My dad one day at the store opened the Houston Chronicle, and he opened the Chronicle and saw a small excerpt about a place called the Menninger Clinic that some Houstonians were going to work hard to bring to Texas. And as he was reading about Menninger, he saw that they had an OCD program, so he picked up the phone and called. And before you knew it, my parents made the decision to take me to an inpatient facility that at the time was in Topeka, Kansas. It shouldn't be serendipity that we stumble across good treatment. But it's what it is for most people with mental health. And so I was 15 years old. My parents decided to take me to Menninger. It was not a good story, how we got there and the way it looked. And I remember thinking to myself, this is the start of the future I've been told that I would have. This is where my parents will drop me off and not come back. Because I knew and I had seen the impact my illness had had on our family system. I felt like this extreme burden, and I wanted to do anything to get rid of that. So my parents flew me to Topeka, and we got there. And I remember begging and crying, telling them I would try harder. I would do better. And my sister talks a lot about this being such a difficult time for her because she knew I had no control over my illness. And the reality is if I had been diagnosed with cancer or a medical condition, would I be saying I was sorry and I would try harder? Would I have felt like this was my fault? Would I have felt like it was my problem that I was impacting everybody? But unfortunately, the way we treat, understand, and talk about mental health is just so different. I have not quite been able to figure out why we treat the brain so much different than the body. And I hope that we can start to change that message. And so my parents, who really were my champions, made this difficult decision. And someone asked my mom, she talks about it, someone said to her, Linda, what if Liz never talks to you again? What if she's so upset with you? And my mom talks about that decision, and she said, I'm willing to risk our entire relationship if there's a chance that this place can help her. And so we got to Menninger that day, and my parents were going to leave me, and my mom said to me, Liz, I promise when you get better, you're going to get to come home. And I believed that. I knew she meant that when she said it. The problem is I didn't think I could get better. I had never in my life met somebody else with OCD, and I had never met somebody who could actually help me. I walked into Menninger that day, and there was a young girl named Amy who was sitting on the couch. And I will never forget, all she said to me is, it's okay, I cried too. And for the first time in my life, I realized there was a community of individuals available to me or to anybody with mental health disorders that would allow us to recognize we are not alone in our struggles. It was the first time I realized there's other people struggling just like me. And then I sat in a conference room with a clinician who would save my life. And I remember trying to hide my symptoms, pretend like they weren't that bad, hoping they would let me go home. And he knew what questions to ask and how to assess appropriately to not miss things. But I also remember for the first time feeling like he wasn't afraid of me. He wasn't afraid of how dark my thoughts were, of how intrusive my obsessions were, or the rituals. And instead, he had this, not egotistical, but this confidence that he could help me because he had done it before. He had been trained and he knew how to appropriately address what I was dealing with. And so the right treatment and the right care is what really will change lives. I don't need to talk about the depths of my illness because I don't think you guys would be sitting in this room if you haven't been touched by mental health. You know what the depths feel like, and they're dark. And it often feels like you are imprisoned by this illness and that it is a true nightmare every moment that you're awake. But at the same time, what I know is that with effective treatment, help and hope truly are available. And my goal is that we can understand it takes a lot for someone to get there. It takes someone being their champion. And for many people, they don't have a mom and dad who are going to do that for them. Many times it is that person, that clinician at Mosaics that answers that phone call. Many times it's you as a coworker that listens to somebody's struggles and helps get them to the right help. But we have to be champions for people who need it. I talk a lot about how if you're driving down the road and you were to see somebody collapse and it appears they have a heart attack, most of us would know what to do. We would stop and call 911, right, and hope that help arrives for that individual. But when we're driving down the road and we see somebody who's clearly in a mental health episode, we tend to lock our doors and turn the other way. And the reality is that is what we do because we don't know how to help. We don't know what the lifeline is for individuals struggling with mental illness. And that has to change. Mental illness is one of the leading deaths in the United States, and it has continued to increase since COVID. And of course, we've seen this in recent years continue to skyrocket. But what we also know is that with effective diagnosis and effective treatment, individuals can live full, productive lives. If I wasn't up here telling my story, you would have no idea that I live with a mental health condition. It is not visible from the outside until it is. And it's our job to try to stop when it is visible from it becoming invisible because people don't know where to turn. Our goal is that we can get individuals to the right help so that they can have the life they deserve despite their diagnosis. And we all know that that's not just critical, but it's actually feasible for everybody. And so you have to have a champion. We have to be someone's champion, and they have to have a community. They have to know that they are not alone. They have to meet other people who are struggling, and they have to be able to understand that there are other people who live with similar illnesses. And then, of course, we have to have effective care. When I first learned about Mosaics of Mercy, honestly, I kind of thought it's a little bit too good to be true. I was like, oh, there's not really an organization that helps do this, right? We've always talked, so many of us talk about how this is needed. And I learned about the ability for someone to call and talk to a clinician and tell their story once. For that clinician to be able to curate effective resources. And I can promise you, I've gotten calls from Mosaic saying we have a patient with OCD, who should we refer them to? So I know that they are working tirelessly to get individuals to the right treatment. And that is the life-saving care that everybody deserves access to. My piece I always like to leave with is that for all intents and purposes, if things wouldn't have randomly fallen into place, I wouldn't be standing here. But I got lucky. And luck is not what we should hang our hats on. especially when there's the ability for us to be able to guide people effectively. My story, which is one that, yes, I am proud of. Like, I will tell you that my treatment was really hard, and it still is. But today I get to stand in front of you as somebody who now runs the same residential program that saved my life. And thank you. I can promise you that myself and so many in this room will not stop doing the work that we do until we know that everybody with mental health conditions can get access to the care that they need and that will save their life. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the work that you do. And I hope we can find a way to make my story not be the exception, but be the norm. Thank you very much.